Good evening and welcome to tonight's Global
Hello.
Conversation in Literacy with Dr. David Berliner. It's nice to see returning to CLR participants and welcome to those of you joining us for the first time. We hope you will continue to return to future presentations. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albert, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, and Aaron Cho, a Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. We also have a research team of doctoral students from Georgia State University and a doctoral student from the University of Pennsylvania. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the field of literacy and language arts. GCLR currently seeks volunteers for a study on the nature of technology-mediated interactions within literacy-focused web seminars. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area, and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment.
I just
also,
hit it again.
We invite all participants to take our GCLR survey. The hyperlink is on our website.
Can you hear me now? No? You can?
The collective data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarship across the world. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box and Dr. Berliner will address these at the end of his presentation. We would love to know from where you're participating in tonight's seminar, so please use the wand tool and click your location on the map. Dr. David Berliner is an internationally recognized scholar and speaker who has presented widely in the areas of educational policy, classroom teaching and learning, and teacher education. Currently a Regent Professor of Education Emeritus at Arizona State University, he has been a member of the faculty at the University of Massachusetts, Teachers College, and Stanford University. His teaching extends worldwide to Canada, Australia, Spain, Switzerland, and Denmark. Dr. Berliner's work focuses on critical issues facing today's schools and educational policies that undergird them. Dr. Berliner has published extensively and is well known for bestsellers The Manufacturer Crisis and Collateral Damage. In his most recent published book, Victimizes and Lies That Threaten America's Public Schools, Dr. Berliner offers that the public's misconceptions of students' test scores, teachers' quality, and university school spending have overshaded the critical, but also very profound issues at the heart of school improvement. At this time, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Berliner in his presentation entitled Education, Politics, and Literacy. Let's give him a virtual round of applause.
Okay. Hi, everybody. We have a little bit of a problem. You can hear me, but I can't hear you. So I'll get some messages over my phone. I want to talk about education, politics, and literacy, and do that by referencing a new book that we have out. If I can make the slide move, there it is. The book is 50 Myths and Lies That Threaten America's Public Schools. It's written by Jean Glass and me and about 19 of our graduate students. And what we wanted to do was get back at people who were saying terrible things about our schools, some of which are completely unfounded, and people were simply lying. We didn't put lies in the title originally, but then we realized people really were lying. So we decided to go after them with a book that documents 50 things we think are wrong with the way people think about schools. But let me give you an example of what I mean when I say people say really stupid things or do stupid things. That's a kind of harsh language, but you know that around 2002, 2003, with George Bush in the White House, with almost unanimity in the Senate and the House, a law was passed, No Child Left Behind. The law was passed stating essentially that 100% of our children by the year 2014, this year, would be proficient. Now, any definition of proficient is well above average. So essentially, our Congress and all the members signed on to a law that was patently stupid. It basically said we're going to have 100% of the children above average. And some of you may know the show about Lake Wobegon. That's the only place in the United States where all the children are above average. And of course, it is a fictitious place. So what we did was get concerned about people saying silly things, stupid things. We wondered why our Congress would do that. Most of them went to school. Most of them know what average means. Why would they do that? Of course, we do have about 45 days left in 2014. Maybe we can move them all to above average now. Another thing the current Congress did, because Barack Obama joins George Bush in passing stupid laws or recommending stupid things, this is the current use of value-added models of evaluating teachers, in which teachers are evaluated using their student test scores. Now, I say that's really stupid because I'll give you two reasons why that is, but there are 7, 8, or 9 other reasons. But the two stupidest, I think, is that if the inference you want to make is about a teacher, and you want to use a student's test scores, standardized test scores, to make that inference that a teacher is better or worse, good or bad, then you have to be sure that the items on the test will actually shift as a function of good teaching. That's reasonable. That's what validity is all about, the power of the argument. I will state, and I don't think I'm wrong, that there isn't a single standardized test in the United States that has ever guaranteed that an item will shift on that test as a function of a good teacher teaching the unit for which that test item was perfectly sensible to use. So what we have is a test that's insensitive to instruction, maybe. We don't know because no one ever tested that. It can be tested. Jim Popham and others have been arguing for years, along with me, that we can develop instructionally sensitive tests, but nobody's willing to pay the price to do so, and they are willing to pass laws that are stupid. That's the politics involved here. So we have a problem of instructional insensitivity, perhaps, making the tests invalid. And then we have the year-to-year reliability problem, meaning that a teacher thought to add value one year is likely not to be thought to add value another. They could have 2 classes in the same semester, and in one class they look like a high value-added teacher, and another one not. The reasons for that are many, but among them are who is in the class. 2 extra special ed kids, 2 extra English language learners, or 1 extra behavior problem, and classes change. The context of the class changes. So that's what we mean about stupid laws. Then there are people who should know better who say really stupid things. For example, Bill Gates, one of the richest men in the world, not too long ago said that the American schools are doing very poorly because we pay lots more money for them and the scores on all the tests are flat. Now let's take him at his word. He's a very nice man, evidently. He's put a lot of money into medicine. He probably cares a great deal about education. But if you've got $50 billion, you should be careful with what you say. So he says the money is up. Well, he is right, but the intimation is that people are being paid huge salaries, or there's lots of waste, fraud, and abuse, and none of that seems true. Financing of America's schools is up. It's up because we have a much larger number of special ed students, and they cost a lot more. And some of those students don't just cost a lot more, they cost dramatically more, 5, 6, 7 times what an average student costs. And instead of being upset about that, we should be rather proud of the fact that we, caring Americans, led the world in getting them to think about how to handle children with disabilities and how to help families all around our country, and turns out in the Western world as well, cope with the disabilities. That's a community issue. We should pay for that sort of thing. What Bill Gates didn't say was that transportation costs have been up, that testing costs are up because people are making big profits off the tests, and the newest tests require new platforms, computer platforms, and the costs are up to test. So Bill Gates misunderstands the issue of cost. But let's talk about the other statement he made, which is that the test scores are flat. Well, I don't know what you'll see here, but I'll go back to that in a minute. Here are the test scores that we have from 1978 or 1980 to 2012 on the NAEP tests, which are the best tests America has, probably, for plotting these sorts of things. And if you look at mathematics at age 9 and 13, and you look at reading age 9 and 13, you will see over on the right of this that white students are up 28 points, black students are up 34 points, Hispanic students are up 31 points, white students 21, 34, 33. That's in math. In reading, up, 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 up. There isn't a single case in which the scores are flat or negative. They're all up. So, Mr. Gates, my advice to you is when you talk about education and not about Microsoft, with your $50 billion, you should get a fact checker. That's what we try to do in our book, and is check our facts and check what other people are saying. Now, we used as our guide in our book, excuse me, we used as a guide a number of people that are saying or so. Let me go back to that. We found Thomas Jefferson saying in 1816, ridicule is the only weapon that can be used against unintelligible propositions, like No Child Left Behind, the use of VAMs, Mr. Gates' statements. We use ridicule. The book is a little snarky, as we say. Another statement we thought was interesting is Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, once saying, "You are entitled, sir, to your own opinions, but not your own facts." I mean, facts are pretty, stubborn things. Excuse me, I have a cold. There's also an old Latin saying, a quote, gratis assertur, gratis negatur, that which is alleged without proof may be dismissed without explanation. So, Mr. Gates, you claim the scores are flat. I dismiss it without even bothering, but I got the proof anyway. And then we used Noam Chomsky, who we, both Gene and I and our students, think so much of. And Noam Chomsky said educational reform is a euphemism for the destruction of public education. That's a harsh statement, but it may be true. A lot of the people who are in reformers' clothing are really in school destroyer clothing. They are wolves, not sheep. And they have to be, I think you have to be careful. Some reformers are genuine. Many are not in this day and age of how to make a buck out of education. So those were our models, and we saw the politics all around us. It's kind of mean. It's kind of nasty. People were saying things like we need charters. They were going to revolutionize the schools. Well, we've had charters for a decade or more now. There doesn't seem to be anything revolutionary about them. They certainly haven't taught the public schools anything. If anything, the public schools have been teaching the charters how to run their schools. Certainly, they're not better than our public schools. In fact, the majority of them do the same or worse. So it's quite clear that charters aren't leading us. We find out that in analysis of all the privates, Catholic private, Lutheran private, other religious private, and secular private, or non-secular, the non-religious private schools, we find out that when you look at them, they all are doing better than a matched public school on things like the NAEP test, until you control for social class. The minute you control for social class, not a single one of them is doing better than their matched public schools. So neither Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, other Christian schools, or non-denominational private schools, none of them do better than their matched public schools as long as you control for social class. So it's hard to say that all of the people wanting privatization and vouchers and tax credits and charters, it's hard to say they're going to lead us anywhere but a destruction of one of America's greatest inventions, which is our public schools. Anyway, they say bad things that are simply not true, and I want to get to that now. Let's look at how bad our schools are by looking at the Pearls test. This is the reading test that's international, and there it is. And if you look at the Pearls test, you will see that as the percentage of children in poverty gets greater, the scores go down. So in schools where less than 10% of the families are in poverty, you see a score of 605 in reading. That's well above the United States average, and it's well above the Pearls international average, in which I forget, maybe 50 countries and jurisdictions participated. Then the scores go down to 584 in schools where 10 to 25% are in poverty, etc., and down to 520, which is still above the Pearls average, but above the U.S. average, but below the U.S. average. So what you see is about almost a standard deviation in difference between kids who go to schools with poor kids and kids who go to schools with rich kids. And the question is, how can you have a bad curriculum, like Common Core claims? How can you have such bad teachers, like others say? These are often the same teachers a couple of years later as they move out of one part of their district into another, etc. We got a lot of criticisms of our schools, including why Johnny can't read, when it turns out if you look back at the group that scored 605 on this test with a mean of 500, these are kids in schools where less than 10% of the kids are in poverty. You will find that they actually scored higher than any other nation in the world. So you folks interested in literacy and politics, the politics are our kids can't read. The actual literacy rate of the people who say that must be quite low because, in fact, many of our kids scored better than the rest of the world. If you take that next group, they scored remarkably high. The two groups together formed 12 million American public school students who did really, really well. Even the middle group scored about at the U.S. average, which was well above the international average. So the three groups on your left, where kids are in school with under 10% in poverty, 10 to 25% in poverty, 25 to 50% in poverty, these are middle class, upper working class, upper class kids in public schools. There's 25 million of them, and they scored better than the rest of the world, many of them outscoring the rest of the world. Over on the right, we have poor kids. Those schools are not doing well. What is the takeaway from this? It's pretty simple. The statement that America's public schools are not doing well is demonstrably false. The statement that some of our schools are not doing very well is true, and there's a common thread to every school not doing well. The common thread is the poverty of the families that are there. Not well known is that the United States engages in something called apartheid light, as Jonathan Kozol said. This is the beautiful American idea that you can be anything you want to be, you can live anywhere you want to be, anywhere you want. The only problem is you can live anywhere you want, provided you can pay the freight. And I'm afraid that means in the United States that we get a ghettoization of poor kids and wealthy kids. And what's happened is that we have an apartheid-like system, not by law, but by income. For example, 40%, give or take a few percent, about 40% of black kids in the United States go to schools that are 90% minority or more. Almost 40% of Hispanic kids go to schools that are about 90% or more minority. About 20% of American Indian kids go to schools that are minority, 90% or more. But get this, only 1% of white children go to schools that are 90% or more minority. America has an apartheid system of schooling. We put rich kids with rich kids, poor kids with poor kids, and the schools reflect those cultural differences, those economic differences. Well, it's clearly that's a political issue having to do where people are housed. Singapore had the chance to change that. They have much more integrated housing. So it's a political issue, and it can be solved by politics if we were willing. Housing policy is political. Let me show you, it's not just pearls that we're talking about here. Here is the PISA test, which always gets so much publicity. And the bar at the top says less than 10%, meaning less than 10% of the families are in poverty. And the score there is 559. The next bar is 10 to 25% in poverty. That score is 524. And the interesting thing is about, you hear all the horrible things you hear about America scoring on the PISA test, but did you know that the first bar, less than 10% families in poverty, scored either first or second in the world? I'm trying to figure that out. My own data, I got two different reports. But together, the two of them, I think the second group scored about sixth in the world. And together, that's 12 million or so kids out-reading the rest of the world. And what's more important is that reading is the basis for mathematical achievement and science achievement, not the other way around. So that the fact that we're doing so well in literacy, as so many of you are concerned about, says that America is really a remarkable nation. If children are not feeling the scourge of poverty, if teachers are not feeling the scourge of poverty, if neighborhoods are not feeling the scourge of poverty, they do really quite well. Let me give you an example of how these outside school factors enter into the problem of reading and everything else. I'm going to do a little thought experiment with those of you online. We'll get some time for questions in about 10, 12 minutes or so. I'm going to ask you to look at some data I have for you. I'm going to ask you to make a decision about which American state might actually be outscoring the other one in literacy, in mathematics, in science, in any of the tests we have that measure, the standardized tests that measure how kids are doing. Let's take a look at that by going to this first slide. If you look at row 1, there's the percent of 3 and 4-year-olds attending a state-associated kindergarten. In one state, it was 8.8%, in another was 1.7%. So right off the bat, you have a difference in preschool attendance, and that might lead somebody to say, well, state A looks better than state B, but surely it's too soon to tell. Let's go to row 2, the percentage of children living in poverty. 14% in state A, 24% in state B. Well, that again looks like state A does better than state B. And please note that row 1 and row 2 are political issues. That's something that can be solved, and it is being solved in one state and not the other. How about the percentage of households with food insecurity? 11.4% in one state, 14.9% in the other. Are you willing, with just this little bit of data, to make a decision about which state kids will do better on reading tests? Well, it's probably too soon to tell, so why don't you hold off a little? Let's go to row 4. That's in 2012, the percentage without health insurance, 3.8% versus 17.7%. Well, it looks like the trend is continuing. How about row 5, per capita personal income? 54,000 in one state, 35,000 in the other. One state is well above the national average, one state well below the national average. How about row 6, per capita spending on education? 2,700 in one state, 2,000 in another. How about the pupil-teacher ratio? 14.5 to 1, 19.8 to 1. Now, by this time, I bet almost everybody listening to me is willing to say State A is going to have kids who outperform State B. Well, let's go on. Just continues. This is class size in the elementary grades, 18.7 versus 23.5. Class size in the secondary grades, 20.6 versus 25.6. Percent with bachelor's degree in the population, 38.7 versus 28.4. Public libraries for states that are similarly sized, 370 in State A. So if you want to read, you can find a place. You want to borrow a book, you can find a place to do so. All of you know Steve Passion's work, in which libraries play a very important role in the literacy of a state. And over in State B, only 69 public libraries are available. Looks like a big difference there in the literacy community who I'm addressing tonight and knows what that means. Percent of teachers with master's degrees, row 12, 62%, 41%. Teacher salaries, 72,000 average versus 46,000 average. And that should read 1.5%, I believe, in row 14. That is, during the recession in State A, salaries went up. During the recession in State B, like many other states, salaries went down. Now, the important thing is, I'll bet there is nobody out there who says that State B will outperform State A. I'm just betting that, because I've done this experiment with live people, and they always come up with the same thing. It's a given that they'll do better in State A than in State B. But notice what I left out of here. I left out of here everything the reformers in education say is wrong with our schools. I didn't tell you anything about the unions in the two states. In fact, one is highly unionized and one is not. I didn't tell you anything about the curriculum in the states. I didn't tell you anything about the quality of the teachers, the teacher training institutions. I didn't give you anything about inside the school factors. What are they doing? What I didn't do is tell you about the disciplines in the schools. I didn't tell you about the poverty rates particularly. I did. I'm sorry. The important thing is you made a decision based on outside of school factors. That's what I'm trying to communicate. You made a decision that you know, and you were sure very quickly that you knew where kids were going to do better in school. And you didn't have to know anything about the teachers. You didn't have to know anything about administrators, the curriculum, the textbooks, anything. So what does it tell you? It tells you that the outside of school factors are really important. And everybody is concentrating on what we can do to help teachers get better and not concentrating on how we can help some of our states take care of its populations better. These states are real. The State B is my state of Arizona. And if any of you are listening from Arizona, you know what an abysmal situation we have here. Last year, for example, we found out that 6,000 phone calls went to Child Protective Services reporting child abuse, child neglect, child sexual trafficking, beatings of children. 6,000 phone calls went in. Not one single phone call was answered. Not one. Okay? So it's State B is by design. People don't want to pay the money to take care of children or take care of its state. State A is also by design. It is a progressive state. It's a highly unionized state. It takes care of its children better. It looks more like Finland and Norway and Denmark than it does like Alabama, Mississippi, or Arizona. State B is Massachusetts. So we have the two states. How did they actually do? Well, Massachusetts in math, they tied for number one in the country. On NAEP, 16% scored advance. In Arizona in math, they were behind 32 other states, 7% scored advance. In reading, which interests you the most, Massachusetts tied for first, 14% scored advance on the NAEP. This is 8th grade. And in Arizona, they were behind 44 other states, only 5% scoring advance. My point, again, is that these are important out-of-school factors that determine what goes on in school. And there's no getting around from that, I'm afraid. We learned that about the kind of green on this, the out-of-school factors and how they affect achievement test scores. If you think of all that variation in achievement test scores, out-of-school factors account for about 60% of it. And if you look at the school factors, the teacher and school factors, they each account for about 10% of the variation in those test scores. In other words, schools account for about 20% of the variation in test scores. Out-of-school factors about 60% of that variation. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. And if you ask about teachers, they account for about 10% of the variation, about half the school effect. And 60% is still outside. So we're talking about 6-to-1 ratios. That's really rather important to understand. While everybody's blaming teachers, maybe we should look in the mirror and blame how we run our society. Might also say that if you think about it and ask what percentage of time a child spends in their home and neighborhood growing up between birth and 18 years of age, and what percentage of the time they spend in school between birth and 18 years of age, the answer is rather shocking to some people. They spend about 10-12% of their time in school, 88 or 90% of their time outside of school, in their families and in the neighborhood. And if families and neighborhoods are not healthy, if they're not strong, if they're not loving, if they're not protective, then we have a problem. And it's exactly the problem I showed you with the PEARLS testing and the PISA testing. And we could look at the TIMS testing as well. We have a problem. Schools where poor children go to school are not doing well. Schools where children go to school among the middle and upper middle class are doing very well. It's not an even distribution that we have. What are the outside of school factors that occur what's happening inside of school on the reading test and all the other tests? The percent of low birth weight children in the neighborhood, the inadequate medical, dental, and vision care in family and neighborhood, food insecurity in family, environmental pollutants. It's not wealthy kids who live near garbage dumps and incinerators. It's not them at all. Family relations and family stress, percent of mothers at the school site that are single or in their teens, percent of mothers at the school site that do not possess a high school degree, the language spoken at home, family income, etc., etc. Lots of factors affecting what goes on inside the school. But that's not all. These are inside the school factors that affect what teachers do in the classroom, but over which teachers have no control, like class size, the quality of the principal and other administrators, collective efficacy of the faculty, teacher turnover or teacher churn rates, the quality of the school facilities, the quality and frequency of professional development opportunities, the curriculum, etc. So these are all factors accounting for about 70% of the variation in scores for which the teachers are getting blamed. And that's ludicrous, just not fair at all. Here's a very important graph that tells us about what's happened in the United States due to the political system we have. And it's with this graph I think I'll be ending my presentation so we can chat. Sean Reardon at Stanford, a sociologist with wonderful statistical skills, took a whole bunch of tests from 1940 through the year 2005. He put them all on the same metric, and he asked a simple question: how far apart was the child from the family at the 90th percentile in income from a child in a family at the 10th percentile of income? So he took the gap between a rich but not the richest kid and a poor but not the poorest kid in a pile of data that he was able to look at in 1940, 1950, 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000. Standardized it all, looked at them, and discovered an interesting thing. The gap around 1940 was about 0.6 of a standard deviation, meaning that the overlap of the two curves of poor and rich kids was, if they were there, rich kids almost always do better than poor kids in every society we know, but that the gaps between the two were not huge. If you follow that line straight up, It ends up at about 2005, where the gap is 1.25 standard deviations. The rich have pulled way away from the poor in terms of their performance on standardized tests, on the test of reading, other English language arts tests, mathematics, and science. What that means is that as we enter a knowledge economy, then the rich will have all the advantages because they're pulling away from the poor. We did this analysis with the middle class, a child at the 50th percentile of family income. And again, he went back to the 1940s and plotted it out. And the gap was smaller in the 1940s, and the gap has opened up wider in recent years. The rich are getting richer in their ability to pass the tests, get into the best colleges, hold down the best jobs. The middle class and the poor are being frozen out, and those are political issues. Tax structures could change that. The money's all going to the 1%, 2%, 3%, and it's not going to the 90%. We have to change that, and the only way to change that, because we still have the vote, is to vote. This last election, as many of you know, turned out about 30 or 40% of the population. They've given up. They give up. These problems I see will be exacerbated. In the United States, the land of opportunity, a good question to be asked, and PISA testing asked this. If you look over on the left, you're looking at the social class standings of kids. The top quartile social class, top 25%, next 25%, next, and then the bottom quartile. These are four groups of kids. Now, if you look over on the right, we look at the level of achievement on the PISA test. Top quartile of kids in reading, math, and science combined. Next quartile, bottom quartile. The question for America was, it's a political question. It has to do with redistribution of wealth in America. The question is, what percent from the bottom quartile in social class are in that top quartile in achievement? Because if we believe the Horatio Alger myth, if we believe you can be anything you want to be, if we believe that hard work will get you anywhere you want to go in this country, if we continue to believe that, that percent better be reasonably high. Well, the data is reasonably clear. Only 6% of children in the bottom quartile of social class standing are going into the top quartile in achievement. So only small percentages of our poor kids will end up at Stanford or Harvard or Yale or Princeton. Now they may well go to other fine universities, including my own. But there's something wrong when we have so little breaking through. Something's wrong with our economic system. Something's wrong with our educational system, where this becomes the norm. And the country is going to have a hard time standing up to this over the years. Final graph for you to consider, because poverty is an economic issue and a political issue. This is a graph of PISA nations. The FIN stands for Finland at the upper left. The USA is down there on the lower right. Given on the abscissa is the Gini coefficient. This is a measure of inequality in societies. So if you're on the left of the Gini coefficient midpoint, you're in a more equal society. If you're on the right, you're in a more unequal society. The USA is among the most unequal of the rich nations. We're out there on the right. Now, if you look on the average math achievement, but this holds for reading as well, you will see where the best fit line goes through. And you'll see that Finland is among the most high-scoring nation in the world in this particular PISA administration. PISA, as you know, has about 4% of its children in poverty. And as you may know, the USA has 22 or 24% of its children in poverty. So our children are very impoverished compared to Finland, and Finland's score is much higher than ours. Now, here's what this researcher, Condren, did in 2011. He said, because this is a multiple regression equation, if I tweak some of these variables in the multiple regression equation, and I give Finland the score of America's on child poverty, and I give the USA the score of Finland on child poverty, what would happen to the Finnish scores and the US scores? Just one variable, just change one variable to see what would happen to literacy, science, and math scores. Okay, so he changes Finland to having 24% kids in poverty and changes the USA to having 4% kids in poverty, and guess what happens? Finland drops below that regression line, the USA goes above that regression line. That's all that stands between us and outscoring Finland, is the percentage of poverty in our society. It's not our teachers, it's not our curriculum, it's not our administrators, it's not our textbooks, it's not the number of hours we go to school. Finland goes to school many less hours. What we have is a society that politics has made lame in the international competitions. Policy at Washington and in the States has given us a handicap. They've made us lame, and it's hard to compete with the amount of poverty we have. I'm done, and I think we have about 18 minutes for questions, and I'm not quite sure how they're going to get to me, but we'll figure that out. Let's try that.
Yeah, David, we're going to go ahead and try to do this by the phone. Is that going to work for you?
I'm holding the phone up to me. Go ahead.
It sounds perfect. It was a fantastic talk. Your talk generated just so many questions that our audience wants to hear you speak to. So we're going to start with one. Okay. One of our participants asks, how does poverty produce the low level of education achievement if it has nothing to do with teachers, curriculum, etc.? And you can just go ahead and talk into your computer.
Okay, that's right. You hear me that way. Poverty, someone once said, poverty sucks. And it sucks the life out of families. Very often it's related to a poor educated mother. It could be related to violence in the family. Very often it's related to speaking another language at home, so you have a problem picking up two languages. Very often it's related to crime in the neighborhood, so kids have to stay in. They can't go out and play. Very often it's related to role models in the neighborhood that are missing. So teachers get a chance to play with about 10% of the variation in those test scores every year. You got 12 years. We do create miracles every year. We save children every year, but we do not modify the test scores very much. That's not what teachers do. They save children. They save lives. They touch eternity. But the test scores are not touched very much because they're much more reactive to the conditions under which a child or a cohort of children come to school. I can predict from your zip code how your school is going to be doing. There are exceptions. Thank goodness there's an occasional school that breaks out of that. There are occasional teachers who break the mold. But the rule is the rule. I can predict what your scores will be on the test from your zip codes, knowing your crime rates, knowing your employment rates, knowing your single mother rates, etc. So poverty just delimits the advantages that families can have. If you've ever read Jonathan Kozel's books, you know what it can do to the child's life. They're passionate, wonderful examples. But Jonathan Kozel in his last book also wrote that there is fire in the ashes. An occasional child, an occasional family pulls it together. And then those who say, see, poverty is no excuse, are using the exceptions to do nothing about poverty, because poverty really does suck the life out of families and neighborhoods. Next.
Okay, thank you. That was great, Dr. Berliner. We've had a number of questions about teachers and the role of teachers. So one of the questions is, when we hear that classroom teachers make more of a difference than any other single factor in the classroom, they're looking at those out-of-school factors individually. Is that what you think?
The statement that teachers are the most important outside of their family, the most important in their lives, that's been uttered by lots of people, and it's wrong. The fact that they're the most important in the school is probably correct, but they share that with the school. It looks to me like teachers and school effects are about equal on kids. That means administration counts, That means projects, after-school programs count, all of those things. Teachers are accounting for about 10% of the variance in the test scores. Now, please understand, teachers touch eternity. That's the title of a book by Tom Barone. He could show in beautifully written book, he shows how a teacher 20 years later is sitting on the shoulders of some of his students because he so touched their lives. An occasional teacher changes first grade and second grade literacy so that the kids with that teacher have an advantage all throughout school. An occasional school pulls off a remarkable coup, like Cibola High School in Yuma, Arizona, studied by Ursula Casanova in the book Si Se Puede, in which about 80% or more of Latino kids who are poor go to college every year. The exceptions are there. Schools and teachers work miracles, but they do not move the test scores very much. Please understand, we have chosen the wrong metric. When you choose a metric that's insensitive to instruction and to what teachers do, you're going to die by that metric. Okay? It's just wrong. It's an insensitive metric, and we think it should be sensitive to teachers, and it's not. Okay?
Yeah, okay, good. We have another one a bit related to that in some ways. It's with teachers again. And one of them, there are a number of states that are tying teachers' salaries to test scores, and especially with the growth model. The high poverty schools, this person asks, will appear to be on the bottom, but in fact they're not. How can this be addressed, this role of teacher salary?
Well, I think almost every study of merit pay is a disaster in education. We're not picking tomatoes. If we're going to get merit pay, then I want to pick the kids in my classroom. I want to pick the parents from my classroom. If I'm the coach of a baseball team, I don't take everybody who tries out. I pick the kids so I can compete. And that's what a merit system does, and all the VAMs are merit systems. Let me give you, the first of all is that the VAMs, the student test scores, locate a student in a distribution very nicely. So if I want to know if the kid's at the 30th or the 70th percentile in a distribution of students who are in third grade or fifth grade, the test does that. The minute I use the test to decide something about teacher quality, I'm making an inference that cannot be supported by that test data, those test data. The tests are unreliable, notoriously unreliable. The coefficient of correlation from year to year is between 0.3 and 0.4. That's just not enough to make an important decision about a single teacher. But there's a second reason, is that they're instructionally insensitive. We have no evidence that they move if good teaching took place. A third reason is that different standardized tests give different pictures of who's effective or not. If I give two different reading tests and I get completely different data on who's an effective teacher or not, something's either wrong with the test or the concept of making an inference from it. In addition, observational methods of teachers are also not correlated with the test scores. So when you have observational measures and you have test scores measures, they're only correlated about 0.3, meaning you're getting completely different pictures of who's good and who's not good if you're going to use the test scores. Which one is the better thing to use? I doubt if it's the test. I trust my own observations. I don't trust the score on wine when I get a 91 or an 89. I trust drinking the wine. You want to know how a teacher teaches. You go into the classrooms maybe 5 times, maybe 6 times, maybe once a month. You look at the artifacts of what the teacher's doing, the tests the teacher gives, the assignments the students have, the plays the kids are putting on, the after-school work the kids are doing. You look at the curriculum enacted in a classroom to make a decision about whether you have a high-quality teacher or not. The test scores are not giving you that. There's another reason is that you can't evaluate all the teachers that way because most of the tests are given 3rd to 8th grade, and then in 10th grade. So what do you do with a kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade teacher? Well, in Arizona, we give them the 3rd grade teacher's score. How stupid is that? I'm being judged on another teacher's performance. The history teacher, the science teacher are all being judged on math and reading. in the high school level. These people are crazy because they think the numbers are real that they get, and the numbers are not. Let me say this to everybody listening. Data-driven decision-making, data-driven merit systems, data-driven VAMs are crazy. You want data-informed decision-making. You want data to inform you about how good a teacher is or not. Information is useful if you've got a decent test, it's got some validity, it's got some reliability, you get some scores on it, you should sit down and have a conversation to interpret the data. Data-driven is nuts. Data-informed is sensible, using data to make decisions in a reasonable and a rational way. So I'm against all of this. There's one further thing that nobody seems to understand, and that I find interesting. Teacher effects actually fade. The measured effects actually fade. 1, 2, or 3 years after you've had a teacher, you can't find that teacher's effect in any test scores. Now, does that mean teachers have had no effect? Of course not. We all know that teachers sit on our shoulders. The teachers are in our lives. My life has been affected by teachers who gave me opportunities. My children's lives have been affected. Teachers change lives, but measuring their effects 2 and 3 years later is almost impossible to do. So using those silly metrics to do things like that is I don't know how to say it any better. It's inane.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I wrote, what do you think of EdTPA? We had a couple of questions about that.
What do I think of what?
EdTPA.
EdTPA. I don't.
Yeah, TPA. It's a test. It's sort of it's a monitoring system for teachers here in Georgia, and I suspect in other parts of the country, but perhaps not in Arizona.
That's the observation system. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you heard what I said. Data-informed decision-making is important. I think the instruments you're using in Georgia include the Danielson instrument, and if that's true, it's a very interesting instrument. I think Charlotte Danielson's done a good job of capturing a number of issues. I'm sorry, I should have been here. Charlotte Danielson's done a good deal of thoughtful work about capturing some important dimensions of education. I'm not sure that you need 70 indicators, but certainly the major dimensions are real and important. And if you use that and you use some work, I think Georgia uses something by Piante, also a classroom observation, and you use that to hold a conversation, I think that's wonderful. Those instruments, if teachers and administrators sit down and say, yeah, this is a reasonable look at my classroom, let's see what we get, and let's talk about what the data suggests. I have no problem with that. Reliable instruments could be used to hold good conversation. That's all that should happen. And let me give you another example of what I mean by good conversation. The PISA results come out every year, or every 3 years. And the newspapers go crazy. They condemn everybody. They don't hold the conversation. If our vision of childhood in the United States is different from Korea's, why would you expect the United States to compete with Korea? If they raise, if in one country they raise kids to play cricket, and in another country they raise kids to play baseball, but you test on cricket, the kids who play baseball aren't going to do well. Okay, you have to have a test that reflects what a society does. Our society, and Young Zhao is the best example of this. His new book is Who's Afraid of the Big Red Dragon? His new book talks about the incredible shortfalls of the Chinese childhood, the Chinese education system, but they're wonderful at producing high test scores. You have to hold a conversation to try to get the meaning of the scores you have. I think Danielson's instrument and some others do that, and conversations are helpful for administrators and teachers to have. But to hang a merit system on that, I think that's bizarre. Anytime some indicator becomes overly important, that indicator is corrupted. That's a social science law put forth by Donald Campbell. The more important some indicator becomes, the more likely it is to be corrupted. There's no getting away from that. That's the way the world works. So use the indicator, observation instruments or test scores, to hold meaningful conversations about how to improve instruction, and I'm fine, and the indicator won't get corrupted. Use it to hammer teachers, the indicator will get corrupted, and the whole system falls apart.
We have time for one more question, and I think this one's an interesting one. Why Ruby Payne and not David Berliner's work is being listened to or read?
Well, Ruby Payne, in my reading of her, identifies the culture of poverty and seems to kind of blame the parents, lazy, drinking, the children, violent, and she talks about the culture of poverty. And in my reading of her, she rarely, if ever, talks about the structures that cause that. This is a talk tonight about politics. Structures that cause poverty are political acts. She doesn't talk about the fact that we have isolated poor people in this country, that we have an apartheid-like system, and that gives rise to some of the things she says is in the culture of poverty. Well, the culture of poverty developed. I forget which city in Michigan it was that they made the film What Happened When the Auto Plant Closed. So here was a perfectly good middle-class community. There wasn't the culture of poverty. Kids were achieving okay. The schools were doing okay. And a couple of years later, divorces were rampant. Child abuse was rampant. Violence was up. Kids were not doing well in school. The culture of poverty had come about. That culture of poverty that Ruby Payne would blame on the parents and community, that culture came about because of structural changes by sending the auto plant overseas. So I think it was General Motors at the time, and it was what's his name? The filmmaker, I can't recall. But you all know. It was about General Motors. Roger and Me was the title of the film. And you all know what happened. The city is a disaster. The culture of poverty came out of the structural and political acts that took place. So the difference between Ruby Payne and me is that I can see a political solution to poverty. She can see a kind of social solution. And I'm going to say it'll never take place without structural changes. Some redistribution of wealth, a different tax system, a different housing pattern, different busing patterns, jobs, well-paying jobs will change everything.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Berliner. That was all we have time for, and so now we're just going to conclude the seminar.